With Standard's ban list approaching 15 cards and gameplay coming down to a single subgame with must-answer threats, it feels like Magic might be becoming a bit more like Yu-Gi-Oh! It's not to say that's necessarily a bad thing, I want to be clear, that I think Yu-Gi-Oh! Has come up with some really innovative solutions to problems that other TCGs just kind of didn't have to face because they had things like rotating formats and were, designed with some amount of solutions to the queen problem in mind when the game was initially put together, things like mana cost. And so Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a really interesting study in alternative ways to solve these problems. And one of the most interesting is this idea of archetype design. Archetype design is basically making the most powerful cards contingent on a player playing other cards to sort of give them additional requirements for them to get that powerful criteria. In Magic terms, that would be something like you have a 1 mana draw a card spell that if you control a planeswalker named Jace, you draw 3 cards instead. And Yu-Gi-Oh's design is full of these archetypes, and often a couple of them get sort of mixed together into a single deck. But the most interesting thing about this, from a designer's perspective, is that this is relatively prescriptive, right? We're telling the player that, hey, these cards go together. That has all sorts of implications for game balance and play patterns. Generally speaking, I have an idea of how this works in Yu-Gi-Oh!, but me personally, I don't really know the specifics because I haven't really played Yu-Gi-Oh! That much. So I thought it would be important to bring in a friend who not only has a lot of knowledge about Magic, but also has knowledge about Yu-Gi-Oh! So I called in my friend Elcee, and him and I discussed archetype design, its implications for Magic, and also how this idea applies to games generally. Let's get into it.
Distraction makers.
My name is Elcee. You can find me on YouTube under that name. I am a longtime Magic player, played since like the mid-2000s, but more recently have been getting into a much wider variety of trading card games. Among them, Yu-Gi-Oh! I spent kind of 100 hours learning that game, which is, I think, kind of close to how long you need to actually start to get an appreciation of all the moving parts in the systems in that game. And I now make content broadly about trading card games and the kind of design that exists in them. And
you were part of the Canlander format panel, right?
In 2014 and in 2016, I was on it's called the Council.
Oh, sure.
So I've done 2 terms on that as well. So that's involved with like the format management, deciding the points, having meetings and arguing over which things are broken. I think I may be responsible for one of the single worst ban lists in Canadian Highlander history, which is maybe not a good claim to fame, but probably is one of mine. We reverted a change that I really stumped for actively at a meeting. We reverted it literally 48 hours later. We put Eldritch Evolution to a point, and it caused a significant uproar.
I see. Okay, well, we'll forgive you for that one, but
I would hope so.
Cool. Okay, so yeah, I really wanted to explore what I guess I've been referring to as archetype design, but I think it's more about this kind of spectrum between a design that's more open and a design that's more prescriptive. I would assume it starts at the card level and then sort of moves in the direction of prescribing a deck to players. So I've been thinking about archetype design from that sort of perspective, in that we're designing this game, we're trying to get a hold of the reins of the format, and instead of creating cards that allow players to sort of have this discovery, instead designers are basically saying this is basically the only way that these cards make sense in any kind of a strategy in the meta. So maybe we should just start off with some examples of what archetype design is. Let's start on the most extreme, because I think that's the one that people understand the easiest, which would be something like a card that says, draw a card. But if you control a planeswalker named Jace, you draw 3 cards. It seems to me that Yu-Gi-Oh! Does a lot of this sort of thing instead of having kind of like rotating formats.
One thing that I heard quite recently from a very high-level Yu-Gi-Oh! Player who talks about game design as well, his name's Joshua Schmidt, he was describing the way that Yu-Gi-Oh! Archetypes are built like by Konami, and he was kind of speculating that he actually thinks they might be built backwards, so that
interesting.
Konami starts with what the end of some combo or some sequence of interactions is going to be. And they have like the boss monster, the thing that you are going to end up with, or whatever your end board might look like. And then they work backwards, making the cards that are going to connect to ultimately get you to that point and tune in that way. This differs from Magic still, even in that I think Magic is very much so designed front to back, where you're giving players tools, and probably designers have the ideas of where those tools are ultimately going to end up, but they're not starting at the end and working their way backwards quite so much, even with some of the archetypes.
I like that perspective, right? It's this idea that we're going to either start with an end board state in mind and work backwards from there to figure out, all right, well, how many hoops does a player need to jump through, and how do we want them to navigate to that board position, rather than just providing, okay, well, here's some interesting and unique things to do in the meta, and we'll see kind of what emerges from that. Where Magic has gotten into trouble lately is that their ability to design for emergence, I think, has become problematic, right? Like it's either that there's too many cards in the format, which leads to too many outliers, which leads to decks being able to play multiple outliers in power level so that they just become the most powerful decks. The example of this is it, I think, more than anything else, because it's not just like, here's the most powerful cards. It's also the enablers of those powerful cards, things like sleight of hand and opt being in the format together. And I think that's where you start to turn the corner into, well, if the outliers are going to become the norm, why don't we just design the outliers and prescribe what those are going to be? And I think that's kind of, like what you're describing as Yu-Gi-Oh's approach. We're going to start with the outliers, and then we're going to design our way back to the play pattern.
What happens in Magic is that there are themes, there are archetypes, but they're not quite as prescriptive as in sure. Yu-Gi-Oh! You literally have like the name of the archetype in the card name. I'll describe my favorite archetype, which is Mitsurugi. So all of the cards in this archetype have the word Mitsurugi in the card title. This is an important Magic and Yu-Gi-Oh! Distinction. In Yu-Gi-Oh! There is not the card title matters in Yu-Gi-Oh! I guess I would say. So when a card says search for a Mitsurugi card, in Magic, we would assume that would be a creature type. In Yu-Gi-Oh! It's literally in the title.
Are there multiple Mitsurugis then, or is
they're all Mitsurugis? They have an additional name on top of that. So they're like Habakiri Mitsurugi. They are
I see.
Murakumo Mitsurugi. They're Saji Mitsurugi. They all have kind of a second name. And then Mitsurugi is almost like, you can think of it as an epithet.
So do they have creature types in addition to that, or is this...
Yes, so there are also types on top of that.
Interesting.
So monsters have a type that can be like normal or much, much, much more common in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Basically, every monster is at least an effect monster. And then they have additional typing on top of that. So all of the Mitsurugi monsters are reptiles, which does matter. And we'll talk about it later on, why it matters. But in practice, what matters is that all these cards have the name Mitsurugi in them. And so the way that this archetype works is that it is entirely centered around the kind of main card in the archetype, which is Habakiri Mitsurugi, which is a monster that you can reveal from your hand. And when you reveal it from your hand, you get to go search your deck for any Mitsurugi monster. There are some restrictions that I won't get into for clarity. Put it into play, and then you have to tribute another reptile or another monster. What happens is, though, the way that this archetype is built, it's built where all of the Mitsurugi monsters have an effect either when they're played or when they're tributed, which is basically like sacrificed as an additional cost. You can think of it as. And so what you do is you have this loop or not a loop, but you have this combo that involves reveal Habakiri from your opening hand. You then get to go through a series of effects where you get Asaji, which allows you to get a spell. You get the spell, you play the spell that tribute summons another Mitsurugi monster. You then get to kind of loop through this a couple of times. All of these things, though, care about specifically the Mitsurugi name. And at the end of it, you get a board that has a Mitsurugi Futsu, is its name. And then you also typically have the Murakumo on the board as well. For Magic players, these cards are going to sound absurdly busted. The Murakumo is Plague Wind on ETB. And then it also has an activated ability that counters a spell or counters an effect unless your opponent discards a card. And then the other big monster that you end with the Futsu. Every time your opponent special summons, which spoiler alert, they do a lot, you get to play a Mitsurugi monster from your graveyard. But the important thing for our discussion is that all of these things care specifically about cards with the word Mitsurugi in them. And so all the tutoring that goes on in this combo line is specifically for Mitsurugi cards. It's Mitsurugi Ritual, it's Mitsurugi Prayers, it's et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that is how all the archetypes are designed in Yu-Gi-Oh! Broadly speaking.
So trying to translate this to Magic language, it's basically as if you had a creature that has a tutor spell attached to it for a specific other named creature or creature type. Like, I guess
I think in Magic we would say type. Type gets a little bit broad, obviously. Like, there's not the perfect language to translate it between the two. You might do something like add type plus color or type plus cost as maybe like a slightly more accurate comparison.
What if instead we use something like lesson or arcane? Is that closer?
Yeah, that is closer for sure.
Okay.
Yeah, that's starting to slice it to about the granularity that you have in Yu-Gi-Oh!
That is, I guess, what my working hypothesis was venturing into this space was, okay, we're starting to see lesson, and we're also starting to see batches, which is like historic artifacts, sagas, and legendary creatures as like a container. A batch obviously is a bit less prescriptive than lesson, right? So then the other thing that I've heard in the Yu-Gi-Oh space is that decks will often combine multiple of these archetypes, or is that rare?
No, that's pretty common. And that's where the problems start to come in. So we're going to talk later, obviously, about like why archetype design can be helpful for mitigating balance issues. And one of the big complaints that has come up recently in the Yu-Gi-Oh space is that jamming multiple archetypes into the same deck, into like just kind of this combo slop, people call it, archetype is too easy to do. And so like the Mitsurugi archetype that I've just described is unfortunately one of like the biggest offenders in this category. And the reason is that main card that I was talking about, Habakiri, which is a reptile, is, as it turns out, way too easy to search through other ways that are generic. And the only consideration then becomes deck space rather than like, do you draw both pieces? Because typically one can bridge into the other. The appetite for two archetypes combining together, players tend to be more comfortable with that because there are some archetypes that are very clearly intended to be played together. But what starts to go wrong is when decks start getting to play like 3 or 4 archetypes all in one deck, and you just get access to really like too much gas. Basically, you have too many different pushes, and you get to make too oppressive of an end board by bridging from one engine into another, into another, into another, and you just end up playing these decks where like the deck list is like Azamina, Mitsurugi, Orchist. You know, like it's just these incredibly long names, but it's because all of those archetypes are technically present.
Right. Okay. Thinking about the Magic side of things again. We sort of started to put together a way to visualize, I think, the difference between the ability for you to create open-ended designs versus the ability for you to create prescriptive designs within Magic's systems specifically. And so I'll have the chart on screen here, but basically across the top we have sort of we have our categories, which are color, and then sort of the macro strategy that the the card would fall into. And then we have kind of a primary attribute, a secondary attribute, and a tertiary attribute. And it seems like within Magic systems, the more specific you get with those attributes, the more prescriptive it starts to become. I have color first, as in color is the most open, and I don't think this would be the case in every system if it had something that was equivalent to colors. Magic's baseline systems, it is designed so that you can combine any number of colors that you want to at the cost of consistency. Then we move to sort of the strategy that those cards should fall into, and I think that starts to become slightly more prescriptive because we're saying like an aggressive creature goes in an aggro deck. Then when we start to become a bit even more prescriptive, we're talking about primary card types, which would be creature, sorcery, instant, enchantment, artifact, what are the normal card types of Magic. And I think this This one, these two, I'm not sure if they're in the right order or not, but basically, if you're a deck that is a control deck, you're probably looking for things other than creatures to play. So it's tough to say if this is like chicken or egg, I guess, right? And then secondary category would be something like, this is when we start to get into creature types, which obviously become more prescriptive with things like typal or tribal or whatever you want to call it, decks that have synergies based on elves or whatever. And then the other thing I would put in here too is lessons and arcane. So to me, those feel similar to spell creature types. But then finally, we move to what I think is the most prescriptive stuff. And this is sort of the tertiary elements, where if you're operating with something like a unique resource that can only be spent by certain cards, or you have very specific requirements, which is something like I was describing at the beginning, which is you have a card that costs 1 blue, which says draw a card, but if you control a planeswalker named Jace, you draw 3 cards instead. That obviously has to be played together with a planeswalker named Jace. There might be multiple options for Jace planeswalkers, but it must be played with one of them. But I think there's also a way to become prescriptive in Magic by being way too synergistic. And I think that my best example of this is something like Affinity, where you're playing something like Disciple of the Vault. That to me is something that's so highly synergistic that it basically only goes in a deck that plays tons of artifacts. That's kind of what I'm saying.
If you look at something like Affinity, you can start to see where the cracks in the seams of the system start to form. Affinity, fun fact, in the original Mirrored block, this is where Mark Rosewater wanted to put energy in the first place and couldn't make it because they thought the mechanic was bad.
Yeah, they ended up with charge counters, right?
Yes, exactly. Charge counters were the kind of fixed quote unquote version of energy. But one thing that happened with Affinity even is that when it came out, it was extremely powerful, extremely oppressive. They had to make a bunch of bans and changes, but then largely dormant right after it rotated out of Standard. But because artifacts mattering and playing cards where artifacts matter is broad enough of a slice that you're eventually going to get more cards that make it work. You saw when the modern format was first created, and really for the first like 15 years of the modern format, even now you can still play Affinity, but even with the artifact lands banned, with the problematic Mirrodin cards banned, you still saw Affinity pop up as this very powerful strategy that eventually stopped playing the Affinity cards, right? And I think what you can kind of look at, like now they have things like Kappa Cannoneer, which don't have that has improvised, not Affinity. But it's like one of these things where because they've revisited a lot of these archetypal themes so many times, you end up slicing really wide. And so the archetype that you are theoretically trying to balance by making it constrained and putting it into this kind of tertiary box that we're talking about, it slowly starts to like break containment of that tertiary box. The more that it exists, the more that you print things for it. And I think that that's kind of an interesting thing to talk about with archetypes as a whole and archetype design as a whole. You theoretically have a bunch of pros to it, like we were talking about of, you know, in Yu-Gi-Oh, you get to constrain a powerful interaction. You get to envision what the ending is going to be, work backwards, figure out what the choke points are going to be. But the more times that you start with that ending and work backwards and give more branching paths to get there, the less and less control that you retain over it.
This starts to bring us into like, why do archetype design versus emergent design, I guess, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I think we've entered a space where data is so readily available that it's pretty difficult for emergent design to fulfill the promise that it's making, right? If emergent design is basically saying, hey, there's going to be a whole lot of interesting exploration to happen, and you're going to be able to mix cards together in these new and unique ways, and the meta will turn over when somebody discovers some kind of new emergent idea that creates a whole new deck for people to play. And that just kind of isn't happening anymore. It's tough to say if the metagames themselves are solved now much faster, or if players have decided that they're solved and kind of give up on them, and it's good enough because it's a good enough deck to move through the ranks in Arena Best of One or whatever, right? And get to Mythic, and they're like, all right, well, that was good enough. I did it. It almost turns into more like a player versus environment game at that point, where you don't need to find the most optimal strategies. You just need to find one that's good enough to get you through the game. I think that's the incentive here, to switch more to this archetype design and be able to have like a called shot that says, this is where we effectively know the environment is going to end up. And so we're going to balance around that.
If you look at other games that have started to take this more prescriptive design approach, you can see like more of this DNA as well. Hearthstone, very specifically, like designs really prescriptively. You can look at the new cards coming out in a set, and like of the 30 card deck, you can kind of already project what 24 of the cards are going to be. And then there's some tuning to go with the slots. And what that theoretically allows Blizzard to do is get the design on win rates to be tighter. They missed on the recent set, by the way, with Demon Hunter. It was way too good, but they were able to also very quickly adjust that because they knew exactly where the linchpin points in the archetype were, and they were able to hit the most powerful card right away.
This also gives us a window into the sort of problematic nature of this, where if you're designing archetypes in a digital game, you can patch the cards so that you can fix things when you overshoot, and you make an archetype that escapes containment or is too powerful and just dominates the format. You can go ahead and just nerf those cards to bring it back in line. Where in paper, all you can do is ban, right? Like there's no other recourse.
The ban technique is harder to leverage against emergently designed decks because you'll end up with dialogues about what the problematic card actually is, right? Like recently, Badger Mole Cub got banned out of these like green-white +1/+1 counters aggro decks. But like, is the problem card in that deck Badger Mole Cub? I think basically everyone would say yes. But I think that there would be compelling arguments to make for a card like Urboride as well as being a problematic portion of that deck. It was also part of basically all the best strategies that it started to coalesce around.
Another example there would be like I was saying earlier with Is It Lessons, is the problem the lessons themselves, or is the problem opt and sleight of hand, right? Like, is it that these decks are way too consistently getting to their big payoffs, or are the big payoffs themselves the problem?
With the Grand ban, it kind of exemplifies what you get to do if you are designing really strictly archetypally. You can pretty quickly pinpoint a card that you can remove from the strategy to make it worse. This is something that Yu-Gi-Oh does as well. So if an archetype becomes too powerful, they are hesitant to do this. I will say Yu-Gi-Oh uses a limited and semi-limited list as well, where they just try and hit the consistency of decks, although this approach is largely not loved by the community. I will say, maybe I'm if Yu-Gi-Oh players in the comments sound off and let me know if I'm wrong, but I would say on average, people don't love the fact that the approach is to just, reduce the number of these cards from 3 to 2 or 1 in your deck. But what they will do sometimes is just go outright hit a piece of the end board and take it out of the format, or they will fully remove one of the starters for the combo to make it so that you are less likely to be able to open it in your opening hand. A good example of this is an archetype that has been really like a boogeyman for a number of years in Yu-Gi-Oh at this point, called Malice, which is a sweet archetype. It's Alice in Wonderland themed viruses.
Nice.
And so, thematically, it's a banger. It's a good one.
That's cool.
But, mechanically, super oppressive, really powerful and so what they've ultimately done is they've gone and banned pieces of that end board. They banned Malice Whitebinder, which is like one of the extra deck tools that's very powerful, which has finally gotten it under control, right? Like they tried limiting things, they tried just reducing the consistency, and people were just still play it and win with it.
Okay, so from the perspective of Is It Lessons, right? They decided to ban Grand and not accumulate wisdom, right?
Yeah.
So I feel like that's basically what you're talking about, is like, we're not going to completely get rid of the archetype, although Is It Lessons is probably done at this point, I would imagine, with Grand being gone. Maybe it still hangs around. Well, and Storm Chaser's Talent. Were they even playing Storm Chaser's Talent at this point?
Maybe they weren't. Some shells weren't, but
yeah. So with them, deciding to ban Grand and not accumulate wisdom, I am wondering if that's kind of what we're talking about, right? Like, we're not trying to completely get rid of the archetype. We're trying to remove some of its efficiency. If we're getting into a bit of the pros and cons of archetype design at this point, it is interesting that you can build a structure of a deck, right? Like, here's basically the form we think the deck is going to take. And then you can remove pieces of it that are adding to that efficiency but you might not necessarily get rid of the archetype as a whole. The problematic part of that is that what that means is the archetype might be able to function with fewer cards. And we get into that escaping of containment problem that we were alluding to, right?
Yeah, and that does happen, right? Like, it's funny that I used Malice as an example. Malice very famously tanked a bunch of restrictions and ultimately, like, a bunch of bans. Even it's still top 64 in tournaments now, even with all of these bans, you still see Malice popping up every now and then. And so it can be a situation where, like, maybe you just design an archetype that is so powerful that, like, without just fully gutting it and, like you say, like, you know, banning accumulate wisdom or something like this, it's not going to really ever fully go away. I think there's an argument to be made too about the idea that, like, part of the problem, at least from Magic's standpoint, is because of the way that their sets are designed with regards to limited, they are obligated to revisit sub archetypes more often than other games necessarily would. And so it means, like you've been talking about with these, you know, 1-mana cantrips, like, for limited, you kind of need them for the blue decks in those formats to function. And so they've been printing them. And what they used to do was just print the same one over and over and over again, so that you would only ever have one in the format. But what they've started to do, as sets have started to require more specific theming for universes beyond reasons and otherwise, you've started to see there needing to be diversions, hence why I think you ended up with Lessons as this kind of shell. But Lessons gets supported anytime they make some kind of blue-red spells matter archetype, and the limited environments almost always require that to be the blue-red sub-theme. I mean, like, if you look at the last 6 limited environments, like, how many of them didn't have this at least at some level? And so it is a big problem for WotC in a way where, despite the fact that they are even moving towards these more archetypal designs, they are almost obliged to revisit them and continue to grow that slice, which I think is causing them problems as well.
Yeah, that makes me wonder if there's a risk to, like, you can kind of only be in one camp or the other, right? Like, if you start down the sort of archetype road, it feels like by necessity, you must then continue to limit things more and more to the archetypes, because if you combine generically powerful cards made for emergent design gameplay and powerful archetype design cards, and you put them into the same metagame together, you're going to end up sort of inadvertently powering up some of those archetypes with the more generic cards. And so you almost want to have, like, you know, a sleight of hand that works for Lessons and a sleight of hand that works for elementals, right? But because you have a sleight of hand that works for both of those decks, and then you make another one that works for both of those decks, it's pushing the consistency of those decks past ones that don't have access to those because they're not blue decks, right? Like, so I don't know. It's weird.
I think Badger World Cup's a great example of this. This is just supposed to be some kind of, like, emergent tool, but it's really good in +1/+1 counters decks and in landfall decks. And so it is challenging, I think, for Magic to do this in a way that isn't going to ultimately feel like these slices end up getting too big. And I think the 3-year standard environment is part of the problem here.
Sure. Yeah.
It's like, that's part of why I think they felt the need to make these bans, and why you're going to, I think, see more bans related to this, is like, these cards are just lasting too long, and they have to revisit the archetypes because of the way that Magic is structured. And so, like, they are going to break. The emergent powerful tools are going to break eventually. Like, I'm sure, I would guess we're going to have more bans in this standard environment before it's all said and done. Like, if I had to guess.
There's a weird tension, right? If we're talking about these emergent cards that are being made to fit into, like, a kind of generic, you know, deck emergent ideas, then I think Foundations is probably the set that's designed with that idea in mind, right? Mm-hmm. Where, like, well, these are the cards that are supposed to be able to go wide in a bunch of different strategies, and then we can be more narrow with the sets themselves. I'll keep coming back to Sleight of Hand and Opt, where Sleight of Hand is in Eldraine or something, and then Opt is in Foundations. And so as long as Opt is available, anytime you print another 1-mana blue cantrip, like, you're going to break blue, right? Like, because it's already there.
And anytime you're trying to create a blue-red archetype for limited, you probably need to print a 1-mana cantrip.
Right.
So
Exactly.
what do you do?
Yeah. You need there's just so many different directions that we're being pulled in. And I think previously when we were on the sort of, 2-year standard rotation using Escher's stairwell, which is, okay, we're going to make certain pieces of a set more powerful and we're going to never overlap those powerful sections in the format together. You could do things like, well, we're going to print a powerful, 1 mana blue cantrip in one set way back with like Ponder or Preordain, and then we're not going to print one that's that powerful until that one rotates. And now it just exists in Foundations all the time, So I don't want to necessarily say that Foundations is the problem, but I think it is a contributing factor. I wanted to talk a little bit about games outside of TCGs that we might be able to recontextualize the idea of prescriptive design into. And the game that comes to mind for me is something like Diablo, like an action RPG, where items in that game have some amount of openness and prescription, right? Where item types might limit your ability to combine items with other items. For instance, if an item is two-handed, you cannot combine that item with a shield, right? But you can still equip it as part of your equipment set. Another example is you can have one amulet, but you can have 2 rings. And so rings are slightly less, or slightly more emergent, I suppose, than what an amulet would be, because you can equip 2 of them. But I think the more clear path would be things like set items, where an item is sort of named after some kind of some guy or something that's like, this is his hat and his sword and his pants. And if you collect all 3 of these things and wear them at the same time, you get an additional bonus. This feels very similar to like what we're talking about, right? Like you combine these 3 things together, it becomes a bonus. Therefore, those things should be combined together to get that bonus, right? It's an incentive. And then finally, we have restriction, which is class items, which say only this class can use this. And so I feel like there's almost like 2 different sides here. Like recontextualizing this, it feels like there's 2 different sides to prescription. There's one that is an incentive to combine the things together, but you don't have to. And then there's the sort of class item side of this that says you can only do this with this item.
A bunch of tabletop war games have this same kind of element to it. So like when you're playing Warhammer 40,000, for example, you pick a detachment at the beginning of the game, and that is going to basically inform what units you might take. And it exists on this same spectrum as well. You might have a detachment that just kind of gives like a general bonus to shooting. If you're like, there's an orc detachment that just makes orcs slightly better at shooting, and they're not good at shooting normally. And that's quite open-ended. It says, okay, take this if your army has a little bit more shooting in it. But then it can go all the way to the other side of really prescriptive, where you might have, there's a Necron detachment that basically gives only your destroyer units, which is a specific unit type. It only gives destroyers a bonus. And that says to you, you should be bringing an army that is only this specific unit type. And so we have kind of that same kind of really open-ended and emergent and really prescriptive. And Warhammer's even started to iterate on this further, where they've started to gate like specific stratagems behind specific detachments or specific stratagems behind specific characters and things like this. And so you can really strike this balance of, here's something that you just generically get access to by virtue of playing Eldari, and here's something you get access to for picking a specific detachment, for example. One thing that happens in a lot of these games, though, that we've kind of talked about here, is that by virtue of the collation of data, people eventually find the optimal combination. And so again, it comes back to this question of, should you just be prescriptive so that you know the optimal combination before you ship it, or should you allow this kind of experience to happen at the risk of losing control and ending up in a metagame state, or in a game state, maybe if it's a single player game, that you didn't necessarily anticipate?
Yep. And I think that kind of brings us to maybe some sort of takeaways. It is interesting that you can kind of be on 2 different approaches to this prescription design, whether that's incentivizing players to do it, but not completely gating off the access to the game pieces, versus gating them off completely and siloing them into a faction or into a specific class archetype, that kind of thing. You can create powerful cards within each of those silos, but then one of those silos might end up as just the best option.
But to bring it back to Yu-Gi-Oh, I mean, there is a reason why a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh metagame states end up with like 3 decks that are really like the most playable in the metagame. And there are iterations on exactly how you're playing them, how you're building them. Maybe your interactive pieces are different and you're, trying to target different portions of the metagame. But ultimately, when you really concretely gate things into archetypes, people are pretty quickly going to work out which of these archetypes do the things the best. And from that point, it's on you to design a game system where you can give people good enough reasons to do different things in that game and not just have there be something that is concretely better than everything else and the most powerful thing to do. As long as you can give different payoffs at the end of these different archetypes, I think it's okay. But a lot of the time in trading card games, we do run into this problem where we don't do that. And there is just like conclusively a most consistent, most powerful thing to do. And you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot to not do that.
The systems that have been in place to keep people from being able to play at the game at its most optimal, I think those have mostly been eroded at this point. We could look to something like draft for a minute to say that, like, all right, well, that's a pretty extreme, what I would call a system of entropy, a way for you to gate players away from the most powerful things. And that's like hard built into the system. But there's a vast difference between like, okay, well, I'm going to draft all these cards and then I'm going to play versus I'm going to deck build and create like have a sense of identity around this deck that I play and I've chose to play in the format, and then I'm going to play the game. And so I think we're due for a disruption there, right? Where you find a way to still maintain identity of your type of gameplay, but you don't necessarily get to play that identity to its most extreme. I don't know what that looks like yet, but that's I think where my interest is at this point, is finding out how do we make that, right? Instead of we're going to, and maybe in addition to, we're going to know what the most powerful things are, but instead of just letting them get there immediately and then play in what we hope is a balanced environment, instead we're going to kind of know where players are going to be headed, but we're going to make it really, really difficult for them to get ultimately there, but still maintain that identity. I think that's the really important part of things.
Yeah, I think that's the gazillion-dollar question. How do you manage to make it more difficult to actually find these emergent designs in a world where information travels so quickly? But I agree with you, and I think that ultimately, whether or not your game is hard locked behind archetypes or is more open in its design, you are just going to still run into the situation where people more or less solve it. And so I think it is a question of, how do you make that solution process dynamic and interesting? And how do you make it so that once people have gotten to a solved-ish state, that it is still an engaging and dynamic game.
But yeah, what do you think? Do you think archetype design is too restrictive to players? Do you prefer the emergent style of design where players are sort of discovering archetypes on their own? Or do you see the problem being that the format's going to get solved anyway, so you might as well be able to sort of call the shot about where it's going to end up? Make sure you check out Elcee's channel. There's a link in the description. If you want to join a community of game designers, you want to help others test their games, you can join our Discord. The link's in the description below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.